Andrew MacPherson, live in Leeds, and my role in the Drupal project is I got involved in 2008, I think, and started working on accessibility issues, and having worked on enough of them, I got invited to be one of the maintainers for accessibility. So that's the main thing I do in the project. And in the real world, daytime, I'm mostly a back-end developer. Writing migrations and access checks and things which are very different to accessibility. I'm a back-end developer during the day. I've been working with Annertech, and that's an entirely remote team, but in theory they're based in Ireland, but there's a bunch of us around the UK and France and Denmark and those places. So there's no office, no one in the office, and whilst other people are at home. And it's the first job I've had remote, and I'm doing it a few years now. And when I started, it was really strange. I went and had some training and onboarding in person, and then I was back at home. And one Monday morning, I was in my living room and thinking, "Goodness, I'm actually at work now." There's some great things about the way you can organise your time. You know, you have to be available during office hours, but you don't always have to be thinking at set times. You know, like when you're in an office and you've got to be productive now, or you've got to be productive in this chair, in this desk, and working at home, you just got more freedom to, scratch your head and pace up and down in the kitchen, or go out in the garden, or stuff to do your thinking, and then come back to the keyboard. The downside is the motivation side. It feels like you're back at university with an essay deadline all the time. It can be a bit strange sometimes. If you've got a project that's going on, you suddenly realise, I haven't been out of the house in 3 days, or whatever. You've got to remember to do that, which would come naturally if you did a commute. I think that's the biggest thing that Drupal has done for accessibility. Isn't so much at the code level, it's about the project getting behind it and making it part of its governance structure. The actual leadership buy-in is the really important thing with accessibility. If you haven't got that, then the accessibility team are reduced to people picking fault with codes or colours or markup, and it's only when the organisation gets accessibility that you can manage to make progress on those things. That's where I think Drupal's been one of the leading open source projects for accessibility. Drupal as a content management system has a back-end interface that editors, authors, translators, forum moderators all take part in, and that's a really important thing to get accessible, because Drupal is also a multi-user environment, and so you can have multiple authors, multiple content managers, multiple translators all working on this same back end. Now, there's been a big push in recent versions of Drupal to move the workflow initiative along. And the workflow initiative is, it's about states of content and stuff, but really it's about teams collaborating on the content they're producing. Now, where accessibility is really important, take another part of Drupal, we put a lot of effort into making form errors really, really accessible. And now, form errors are about how an individual is interacting with an interface. But these two tie together, because workflow is about teams and form errors is about individuals. But if an individual has difficulty using part of your interface, then that knocks on, that has an effect on the performance of the whole team. You become a bottleneck, say, if it's really difficult for one person to use that. So knowing that Drupal is increasingly an enterprise sort of system, big organisations, ambitious organisations, well, they have lots and lots of staff, and and they'll gain more staff. You know, when you're hiring staff, you want to know that you're going to be able to support them, whatever their abilities. When you put a system in place, you often expect it's going to last for a number of years, 5 years, say, for an enterprise CMS project. Well, during that time, there's going to be staff turnover. There's going to be staff increases as your organisation gets more successful. And so you need to, and employers have got an obligation to accommodate staff who have disabilities. This comes down to web standards. That is to say, the HTMLs are really, really the most important thing, making sure that when we have this meaning and structure in documents and interfaces, I'm talking about headings, I'm talking about labels for forms, we need to make sure that that isn't just a bunch of divs and spans, but is using meaningful elements. Now, how that translates for assistive technology like a screen reader is that the structure, the headings, this is a first level heading, this is a second and third level heading, these get passed to the assistive technology, and so a user, even though they can't see that there are different font sizes, can still have a clue that lets them build up a mental picture of the document they're dealing with the interface. And the same goes, it's very crucial with the form elements as well. Or any place that you're using images, it's important that someone who can't perceive an image gets to know what that image is there for, what it means, as well as what it depicts. And so that's how the HTML works with accessibility. And then other sides of things like CSS is where the style sheets are where we define the colours and other things like typography. And we want to make sure that for people who are sighted but maybe have problems with colour vision, there might be colourblind users, or they might have varying degrees of loss of sight through glaucoma or other things, that we want to make sure that text is really, really clear, and that's why we have minimum contrasts. So that's how CSS works, and JavaScript plays a part as well, because we're increasingly building more dynamic. Things happen when you play with a page, when you interact with a page. Click here, swipe there. Things change on the page, and those things are governed by JavaScript. And there's an accessibility role there. We need to make sure that when those changes take place, they're also communicated in a way that can be passed on to a screen reader or other assistive tech.
So,
the personalisation is an extra level of accessibility. The first approach is to say, what's our baseline? And so we'd like to say we've got decent colour contrast, we've got decent document structure, and so on. Personalisation is where you might want to let a user have more and more options that they can play with. There's kind of two approaches to that. There's one approach where you can start building some extra little buttons and controls into a web page or an application. You may have seen things that have buttons to let you change colours or let you change a style sheet. There's a downside there, though, that you've got to build and maintain them, and well, you've also got to think carefully about who they're going to serve. So another alternative approach with personalisation is to say, well, you know, we're not going to say you have 3 choices of colour. We're going to say, you know, you can knock yourself out and use any kind of colour changing tool or font resizing tool that is integrated with your browser or integrated with your operating system. And knowing whether you need to build personalisation tools into your application or take a step back and just say, no, it's easier to play nicer with the features that are built into the operating system. It can be a difficult balance to get right, but that's something we're starting to do in Drupal, especially with things like animations. Animations can sometimes make some people queasy or ill with the vestibular disorders, where if the sight, what you're seeing, doesn't match up with what you're feeling, you can become a little bit motion sick from page. Apple had a big problem with this when they brought in some changes to the iOS UI. It had lots of zooming icons and people got queasy about it. But now there's a way that we can respect that. The operating systems can provide an indication at the whole operating system level. I want reduced motion, and that comes through to us as a media query, which we can build around. So we haven't used a lot of animation in Drupal, but some of the things that are coming in with the new authoring tools initiatives, there's new designs for the new tools, and a lot of those have used animation. So I think there's a challenge to make sure we don't rely on the animation and make sure that we let people turn it off if they need to. Yeah, so WCAG 2.0 has been our standard for 10 years now, and the world has moved on since then. Operating systems have changed. Mobile phones and small screens and touch screens are things which have all come into our lives since WCAG 2.0. So WCAG 2.1 is a set of it's an extension to WCAG 2. And it brings in a bunch of other success criteria that you might want to address, and a lot of these are focused on small devices, touch screens. Some of them are focused on that animation issue I mentioned, and some of them are based on cognitive needs as well. Like sometimes on web pages we use terms interchangeably, but they mean the same thing. So sign up or register or sign in or log in. Well, you know, it would be nice if we had a standard way of marking those up so they were always understood. So that's something which we might be able to deal with, so that well, I'm not really sure what's going to go on with that. There's a possibility that some assistive tech might be able to pick up on standard markers and say, right, we'll put some standard icons in here, and that's an aspect of personalisation. That animation issue is something we're going to need to address with for WCAG 2.1. We're following it because it's been a working draft for the last year and a half, and every month when a new draft has come up, what's in, what's out, and try to keep track well in advance of where we're going with what we're going to need to implement in Drupal. Yeah, I don't have any hard data on that, but anecdotally we are hearing that Drupal's accessibility is starting to become a differentiating factor in choosing Drupal. Because it allows you to support more staff. It allows you to it allows organisations to take better responsibility for their staff by having an accessible admin UI. Public sector and third sector as well have historically had more pressure on them to provide accessibility, and it varies a lot in different jurisdictions, but lots of them have some kind of mandate or regulation that they have to follow, just because they're public service organisations. And Drupal doesn't guarantee to solve it for them, because after all, most organisations will put their own front-end design, their public-facing design on there. But what a framework type software can do is provide the best starting point. We can certainly get markup best practices right, even if we know they're going to stick their own custom colours on the front of the website.